By 1500 BC, a peace agreement was reached between the Egyptians and the Semitic Hyksos, which allowed the Hyksos people to leave Egypt peaceably and move to Palestine and Jerusalem in the Egyptian-controlled land of Canaan.
And I'm saying that the people we now call Jews entered world history with their visit to Africa.
Yea, he will murder his brother to possess his brother's land. Let him not breed in great numbers, for he will make a desert of his home and yours.
Modern archaeologists have confirmed that the Hebrews were not a race of people as once thought. They were a Semitic and Asiatic class of foreign workers who migrated into Egypt from neighboring lands.
In history, Pharaoh Ahmose is most famous for expelling a foreign nation from Egypt around 1500 BCE. At the time, Egypt was ruled by a people that the ancients called Hyksos. Until recently, little was known about the Hyksos. Then, in the 1960s, their ancient capital, Avaris, was discovered north of Cairo. Egyptian history clearly states that the Hyksos who ruled mighty Avaris were Semites like the Israelites, and that they left on a mass exodus, known as the Hyksos expulsion.
We have in the Bible the story of the Semites leaving Egypt and going eastward from Egypt. At the same time, independent of the Bible, we have a story of the Hyksos being expelled from Egypt. I think definitely the two stories are related. They're describing the same event from different viewpoints.
If the Hyksos expulsion and the biblical Exodus are really one and the same event, then perhaps we can find the long sought-after proof for the biblical Exodus during the Hyksos period.
The Hyksos and the Hyksos expulsion is what we're talking about when we are talking about the Exodus.
All right, we know from the Bible that the Israelites arrived in Egypt some 200 years before their Exodus. 400 kilometers south of Avaris is the tomb at Beni Hassan. It dates to 1700 BCE. There is a perfectly preserved wall painting here that records an ancient migration into Egypt from the area of modern Israel. As in the Bible, the scene involves bearded Semites riding donkeys and bringing their families and flocks into Egypt. Like the biblical Israelites, they are wearing multicolored tunics. The hieroglyphic inscription on this wall calls these people the Amo. Looking in the right place, during the right time, we are the first to recognize a veritable snapshot of the migration of the biblical Israelites to Egypt.
Shun him. Drive him back into his jungle lair, for he is the harbinger of death.
You read the Bible, if you see all of the entrances of the Hebrews into Egypt, it was for famine. Look it up. Famine. Abraham come into Egypt, famine. Joseph asked Pharaoh to allow his family, Israel and his 12 sons, to come into Egypt. You understand what I'm saying? Why? Famine. Famine. So that right there lets you know what this area was. God damn it, it was not. And so they knew if you could get anywhere down here near Egypt and shit, because this is where all the silk is piling up. This shit down here was lush. And so they would come down. And so the Egyptians, they really didn't give a fuck, They thought that, they hadn't really cultivated that shit too much. Because all of this shit up here was lush. And so they, this down here was like boggy and marshy type of shit. And so they left it alone. And then to the other motherfuckers, that's heaven. They don't mind. They want it. You know what I'm saying? They come down and they begin to settle and settle and settle until colonies start popping up, because the Africans really not seeing any type of threat from these motherfuckers. You know what I'm saying? And so by the time they started to, coming in with raids and shit, they started, harassing the Africans and shit, and then it came a point that they had to put an end to it. They had to put an end to it. And Narmer came down there, who was the first king of Egypt. And you could go Google the Narmer palette, and you see him grabbing that Asian by the motherfucking head, and you see that mace up in the air, and he coming down in the smiting of the enemy. That's what that is. When you see Thor, when you see the Pharaoh with his mace, that's where they get Thor with the hammer. Memphis was underwater, where they built the first capital of Egypt. It was underwater. Narmer came down there, diverted the river, put an S in it, dammed it off, and when the water receded, that's where he built the first capital of Egypt, on that virgin land. So they always looked at the Nile as basically a swampish area. But you can see all the greenery that's even going into the Mediterranean. So that's why you got the Hyksos. They would come in here and they would try to get on this lower area down here, because you can still get a lot of vegetation, as you can see. All of this was the best land. And so they would gather down here, get the crumbs, and then when they got unruly, we would have to come down there and bust their damn head, because they had lost their mind.
Every July, the Nile overflowed, making the desert bloom. Farmers had only to scatter their seeds on the rich silt left in the river's wake to reap 2 harvests a year. Now, the Hyksos held sway over this land.
You see Narmer, and you see the mallet, and you see the catfish. Which one? That's what Narmer means, the fighting catfish. You see him with his apron on, you see him with his leopard tail, you see him with his mace. You see him with his flail, which represents sovereignty, okay? And you can see that he has slayed his enemy, which was the Asiatic, and had cut their damn heads off and put them between their legs, okay? And so the severing of heads is not something that just, the Arab was the one that felt that pain first. And he adopted the tactics. He adopted them tactics, the military tactics that we put on their ass. But when you go to Kemet and you go to the walls, these are the Asiatics. The Nubians, the Ethiopians clearly distinguished themselves from the Asiatics. Now let me show you something. Now this one right here is in Kemet. Now you mean to tell me that ain't the same man? That's the same man. Some more Asiatics. That's what they look like. The Egyptians and Nubians clearly distinguished themselves from Asiatics. Those who contend that the origin of the civilization of the Nile was from Asia should know that under these Asiatics, Egypt entered in the darkest period of her history. Was from Asia should know that under these Asiatics, Egypt entered in the darkest period of her history.
For 3,000 years, our greatest enemies came from Western Asia.
In the ideology of the Egyptians, the foreigner is the inherent enemy, the inherent inferior, over whom the Egyptians have been given divine power by the deities.
They are described as that vile foe, people who are beyond the pale. Foreigners are dirt under the feet of the pharaoh.
Images of foreigners were carved on footstools like this, so Egyptians could show their superiority by literally trampling on them. Libyans, Asiatics, were depicted as ugly, as savages, not worthy of placing a foot on Egyptian sand.
Among Semitic people, herding is highly esteemed. The fact that shepherds and swineherds were the lowest strata of Egyptian society proves that they were not Semitic in origin. Exodus 8, is that 8? That's 8:26 says, Egyptians would not eat with Hebrews because they were shepherds who sacrificed beasts that were an abomination to Egyptians. Now that speaks that in the Bible. It shows you that the Egyptians looked down on the Arabs, looked down on the Hebrews, because they were goat herders still at the time when the Egyptians were building pyramids. Arab or the Semitic or the Sumerian bring anything into Egypt, and at that late date they were still folding up tents, and the goddamn pyramids were already 3,000-4,000 years old. How the hell they gonna bring something into Egypt? The Hyksos, the Persians. They didn't bring nothing into Egypt. They destroyed all of the temples in Lower Egypt. That's why you don't see temples there. Those who contend that the origin of the civilization of the Nile was from Asia should note that under these Asiatics, Egypt entered in the darkest period of her history.
And so when you look down the ancient walls of Kemet, you can see that's exactly who it is. Right now today. That's the Arab that was running up in Kemet in the ancient world, destroying our temples. That's who it is.
You're gonna come in here and usurp our history.